Hereby I open this academic ceremony at Maastricht University. My name is Ton de Goeie. I am the Prorector of the ceremony and Chair of the Degree Committee. First of all, I welcome Mr. Erdem Onan. He will defend in public his academic thesis, which is called Promoting the Self-Regulated Use of Desirable Difficulties, the Case of Interleaved Practice. Welcome all members of the Degree Committee, and in particular I would like to welcome the three supervisors. Professor Aniek de Bruin, she is Professor of Self-Regulation in Higher Education at Maastricht University. Dr. Felicitas Biewer, she is Assistant Professor at Maastricht University. And Dr. Vishnu Wiradjani, he is Assistant Professor at the Atmajaya Catholic University of Indonesia in Jakarta in Indonesia. I will introduce the 5 opponents later during the ceremony. Welcome the audience here in the aula, and I welcome all followers of the live stream. Mr. Onan, may I invite you to give a summary of your thesis, and I wish you success in the coming hour. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear Pro-Rector, the members of the Defense Committee, colleagues, friends, and family. In the upcoming 15 minutes, I'm going to give a brief overview of the research I conducted in the last couple of years. I would like to start off by refreshing our memory. This picture nicely illustrates a typical day of a university student who is perhaps preparing for an upcoming exam, working on an individual assignment, or even preparing for a group session. What this picture nicely shows is that learning, for the most part, is a self-regulated process. It is planned, performed, and controlled by students in a cyclical manner. However, self-regulated learning is not an easy task for many students. It involves a number of critical decisions, such as what to study, how to study, and when to study. Here, a significant challenge is we seldom teach students how to manage this process. We provide them knowledge and skills about a specific subject, but do not teach them about the techniques that would increase their abilities to apply their knowledge in the long term, as well as in the face of diverse situations. You might wonder, university students with years of learning experience should know what worked best. However, research tells a different story. According to survey studies, over 50% of students generally use learning strategies that are less effective for long-term learning, such as highlighting or verbatim note-taking. Thereby, students limit their own academic potential. Complicating things further, students seem to have difficulties in recognizing the effectiveness of learning strategies. Let me try to illustrate that by introducing 2 strategies, namely block and interleaved practice, which concern how to organize learning materials. Imagine that you are tasked to learn multiple categories or concepts. For instance, you are in an art school, and you need to learn the painting styles of various artists. Here, one strategy you can use is block practice, meaning you will study one thing at a time, one category at a time. You will start off, for example, by studying the paintings of Hawkins, and you will study his painting styles exclusively before you move on to the next one. This strategy is very intuitive and commonly used among students, as well as by our educational design. An alternative to block practice is interleaved practice, where students can follow a mixed study order. So instead of studying one category at a time, they can alternate between the painting styles of different artists. And through this repeated alternation, they could complete the remaining materials. What I have introduced so far is a highly influential study in cognitive and educational psychology. Cornell and Bjork invited university students to learn the painting styles of various artists using both strategies. Later, students were tested in their abilities to recognize a novel painting which they have not studied before. Additionally, they reported through which strategies they learned the most. First, I would like to show you the learning effect. Despite the expectations of researchers, learning was actually much better with interleaved practice. In fact, this is the difference whether a student passes or fails an exam. Students, however, believe the exact opposite. Almost 80% of students, they thought they were learning better with blocking. indicating that our own intuition, subjective experiences, and beliefs can be highly misleading when deciding how to study during self-regulated learning. This interleaving effect on learning is not unique to learning painting styles. It has been replicated across a wide range of academic domains as well as learning tasks. For instance, in radiology, problem-solving tasks in mathematics and geometry, when learning grammar, even when learning, developing motor skills. Accordingly, desirable interleaved practice is one of those desirable difficulties for students. It is difficult because it is mentally more taxing. It can also slow down apparent performance. But it is also desirable because it promotes learning in the long term. However, these characteristics seem to confuse students. This is where my PhD project steps in with two main research questions. First is to understand why students refrain from such desirable difficulties. Second, how we can support students to make better strategy choices. As you can guess, as a desirable difficulty, I focused on interleaved practice, since students seem to be particularly biased against this strategy. So the overarching goal of my PhD project is to promote the self-regulated use of interleaved practice. I approach this goal from 4 angles. First, I explore the reasons why students chose blocking or interleaving. Second, I designed and tested the effectiveness of various instructional tools. Third, I developed an adaptive instruction that would take students' unique instructional needs into account so that we can move beyond one-size-fits-all type of approach. Finally, I brought my research into an actual classroom so that we can examine the effectiveness of interleaved practice in an authentic learning environment. Today, I won't go into detail on each study. Instead, I would like to show you the core study design I have been working with. Across my studies, students had the opportunity to use blocking and interleaving. Sometimes they used both strategies. Sometimes they could decide which strategy they wanted to use. Often, but not always, they learned visual categories, such as painting styles, word species, or neuropsychological disorders. Most of my studies included an instructional support as an intervention. Some students received the support and some others did not, and they served as a comparison group. Main outcomes were learning effect, student strategy decisions, strategy beliefs, as well as their actual strategy use. As mentioned, in my first study, I explored the reasons why students use blocked and interleaved practice, and I specifically focused on their subjective experiences. Students used both learning strategies, and during strategy implementation, they rated their perceived effort and perceived learning, so that I could examine how these experiences were associated with their strategy choices. Additionally, I tested the effectiveness of an instructional support, which I call visual feedback prompts. Visual feedback shows students the development of their own subjective experiences. My expectation was that through practice, perceived effort associated with interleaving would decrease, while perceived learning would increase. And if we could show this development to students, they would be more inclined to use interleaving. Results were mixed. Replicating prior research, I found that interleaving led to better learning than block practice. In line with my expectations, perceived effort associated with interleaving decreased, while perceived learning increased. However, as you can see, they did not rival block practice. As a result, visual feedback prompts did not improve their strategy choices. Among others, one important finding was that my findings indicated students did not refrain from interleaved practice because they wanted to take the easy way out by choosing the less effortful strategy. They didn't try to minimize their effort expenditure. Instead, they didn't know how to make sense of this experience. They took them effort as a signal to struggle rather than growth. Because interleaving was more effortful, they thought that they were learning less, therefore they opted for the alternative strategy. In my next study, I wanted to address students' knowledge gaps and misinterpretation of subjective experiences through a more direct approach. The tool I used is called refutations. Refutations are a piece of written instruction that presents information in a very peculiar way. They describe an inaccurate belief, challenge this inaccurate belief immediately, and provide a plausible explanation. I designed 2 refutations, one on the knowledge of learning strategies, one on the interpretation of subjective experiences. In this study, I provided students with a combination of visual feedback prompts and refutations. And the results were quite promising. After a combined training, almost 90% of students decided to use interleaving even 1 week later than the intervention. Importantly, however, the key ingredient for this improvement was refutations. So far in my studies, students could choose between blocking or interleaving. However, they didn't have to organize learning materials themselves. They simply indicated their preference, which is in contrast to real-life situations where students need to organize learning materials themselves. In my third study, I designed a learning task where students could create their own study schedule by arranging learning materials. So they saw a selection page like this, and then they could make many small decisions at the material level by deciding which painting or another visual category they wanted to study. Despite this change in the learning task, the results were consistent. Students in the intervention condition used interleaved practice at a higher rate than students in the control condition. Moreover, this use of interleaved practice was associated with better learning outcomes. So far, I introduced a strategy instruction with 3 main components: 2 refutations, one on the effectiveness of learning strategies, and one on the interpretation of subjective experiences. And the third component was a guided study phase followed by a visual feedback prompt. However, one limitation to this intervention is that it assumes each student requires the same treatment. However, if we consider students' knowledge of learning strategies and actual strategy use as a spectrum, we can expect a diverse profile of students. For instance, such green students, they already have the knowledge and apply the strategies. Actually, they don't need much support. Meanwhile, the red ones, they need much greater support. Yellow students, they have the knowledge, but they don't apply the strategies. Perhaps they need more practice opportunities. In my fourth study, I tried to address this shortcoming by designing an adaptive system that would tailor our strategy instruction to students' unique instructional needs based on these 3 parameters: knowledge of learning strategies, interpretation of subjective experiences, and pre-existing use of learning interleaved practice. I compare the effectiveness of this instructional support with a self-regulated condition in which students could construct their own instruction by deciding which instructional components to receive themselves. Results were somewhat surprising. Both conditions performed equally well. However, there was no difference between when the decision was made by the system or by students. On the one hand, these findings imply that students are not really efficient and very selective in their choices. On the other hand, we can assume that students are willing to invest in themselves by requesting additional support, which I believe is a good news. In my final study, my study is so far what researchers call laboratory research. This is a type of an environment where I usually conduct my research. As you can tell, this is quite different from an actual classroom where many things can go wrong. Furthermore, across my studies, students usually learn visual categories. However, in our education, especially in health professionals education, learning involves more than visual modality, such as auditory modality. I wanted to address these gaps in my final study by bringing my research into an actual classroom. Nursing students from 2 classrooms participated in an auscultation training in which they learned how to diagnose abnormal respiratory sounds. One classroom received training in a blocked fashion. In the other classroom, they received training in an interleaved fashion. And I tested the effectiveness of these strategies in their diagnostic accuracy of novel abnormal respiratory sounds. The results were again quite promising. In terms of learning, I saw a significant interleaving benefit, which was visible immediately after the instruction, as well as 1 week later. However, students had similar biases. Over 50% of students thought that they would learn better with blocking. So, how to help students to make better strategy choices? I would like to conclude my presentation with a few take-home messages. First, students are willing to invest effort but we need to tell them, we need to remind them, effort is indispensable from growth and progress. We need to observe students' knowledge gaps and inaccurate beliefs, and if necessary, we need to challenge them immediately, instead of assuming students would already know, which my studies, as well as extensive literature in the self-regulated learning, show students often lack this knowledge. We need to offer students low-stake practice opportunities. It would be difficult to assume students would engage in such a dramatic behavioral change when there are high stakes involved, for example, before a summative exam. Finally, we need to help students to repeat these practices, and through guided support. They need more repetition and they need more guided support. My studies are not a quick solution, but these are the first initial steps so that we can help students to better self-regulate. We can help students to self-regulate their learning in a more effective manner. Now, thank you for your attention. Dear Pro-Rector, I would like to give the word back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Onan, for this clear summary of your thesis. The opposition will be opened by the chair of the Thesis Assessment Committee, Professor Desiree Joosten ten Brinke, and she is Professor of Learning and Assessment at Maastricht University. Professor Joosten.
This way. Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, congratulations on finalizing your dissertation. I enjoyed reading it. Your work is theoretical and practically relevant and adds to the knowledge base of effective learning strategies. The focus on interleaved practice is particularly interesting as this learning strategy receives less attention than the other effective learning strategies, in my opinion. So this makes also your dissertation original, and very good that several chapters are already published in very good journals. But I'm not here for the compliments. I have also some questions for you. So in general, the conclusion is that interleaved practice results in greater learning and transfer than blocked practice. And in chapter 5, you investigate two approaches in which students get personalized support based on their individual needs. Would you ask one of your paronyms to read proposition 5 for us?
A key challenge to adaptive learning technology is reliably measuring students' unique learning needs.
Thank you. So I like the attention for the personal learning needs. So you emphasize in this chapter the importance of addressing students' differences. And therefore, I would have expected to see also on the analysis side of your studies, of your research, a more individual level approach. For example, in addition to the group level analysis, the group level scores and the standard deviations. If you are looking at the tables you presented, you present the mean scores and standard deviations, and if it's higher than 3, then that indicates a lack of metacognitive awareness. However, these standard deviations are very large, over 1, and showing that the statement with a positive mean, indicating a lack of metacognitive awareness, has also students with metacognitive awareness. Did you also evaluate whether there are patterns on a more individual level?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments. Indeed, actually, I thought about individual differences also at the learning effect level. In particular, when I was thinking of design and strategy interventions, one alternative would be to provide students with personalized feedback on their actual learning. And there actually, I saw that almost 80% of students, they would benefit from interleaving. But here I think the bigger challenge is when we talk about benefit at the individual level, I'm not quite sure what we can conclude. One reason is because when we consider benefit, usually that is the difference between how many categories or paintings or, I don't know, visual categories they answered correctly. And at the individual level, that could be maybe perhaps just 1, 2, or 3 answer, like correct solutions difference. at the group level, that actually gives us much more confidence what really happens. But at the individual level, that could be a challenge to assume that students indeed benefited from one of the other strategy. I think that is one of the main reasons I decided to focus more at the average level than the individual level.
But could it be possible that for some students blocked practice works better than interleaved practice?
Based on the available literature, I wouldn't hypothesize that. There is a research conducted by Professor Veronica Young, and then there they asked students to perform 3 or 4 visual category learning tasks. And one of their main findings was that students benefit from interleaved practice was rather a consistent phenomena. So I think almost 60 or 70% of students, they benefited from interleaving either 3 of the visual category learning tasks or 2 out of 3 visual learning category tasks. So based on that available literature, also from my studies, seeing that there is this, again, like almost 80% of students benefiting from interleaved practice, even at the individual level, that wouldn't be my hypothesis. But also, I wouldn't rule out the possibilities where there could be some cases students can benefit from block practice, or maybe perhaps some boundary conditions. Also, there is limited literature, but perhaps there are some base level knowledge levels perhaps necessary for interleaving effect to appear. Studies that I used, usually I used experimental learning tests, so prior knowledge was not the case, so students were really unfamiliar with the type of materials they were going to learn. Therefore, I wouldn't assume much variation in terms of their prior knowledge. I would expect their prior knowledge to be low. So that would indicate that actually interleaved practice could be beneficiary for even for low prior knowledge situations.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. However, you provide a kind of personalized support with the visualizations.
Yes.
So that's a kind of feedback on their personal level. Looking at those visualizations, in Chapter 2, the visual feedback prompts were presented to students in a different way than in Chapter 3. In Chapter 2, you are presented it by the dependent variable, so a chart for perceived effort and a chart for perceived learning. And in the chapters after that, you present it by the learning strategy. And then you saw per learning strategy the learning effort and the learning perceived learning together. Was this a conscious decision, and what was the reason for the decision to change the way of presentation? I missed this in your dissertation, or maybe I have overread it.
It was indeed a conscious decision, and based on the findings of my first study. In my first study, one of the difficulties was that we observed a lot of experiences for interleaved practice improve with decrease in perceived effort and increase in perceived learning. They do not develop to an extent that they can really rival block practice. So with the second presentation format, actually I aim to reduce students' attempt to compare their experiences immediately with block practice. I wanted them to focus on the developments and improvements in interleaved practice rather than engaging in this more comparative decision. Because when the decision is made only based on these visual graphs, at the individual level, actually the graphs might prompt students to use blocking. So my attempt was to reduce such comparison attempts and to draw their attention to the improvements along with interleaving. So,
okay, yeah, I also thought that the second presentation was more clear for students how to choose. Yes. I was wondering, in your presentation you choose the first one.
Sorry, yeah,
no problem. No, but you showed the presentation, the visualization of the first chapter and not the second chapter or the next chapters. So really, I agree with your choice. And I think I have a little more time. So I continue with another topic, and that's about your studies are positioned within a short period of time. The longest study was in a period of 3 weeks, the last one. And I wonder whether interleaved practice, whether that also works for a longer period of time. And for that question, I think back to my period in secondary education, a long, long time ago, where my mathematics books were ordered in an interleaved practice way. Chapters on statistics alternated with chapters on geometry. I found that incredibly irritating. So when I had an exam on chapters 1 to 4, I first studied chapter 1 and 3, and then I studied chapter 2 and 4. So I must have been one of the students who didn't think about the learning effect, but more about the effort it was costing me. But my question is, does interleaved practice have a similar effect even over these larger units? How do you see this?
It is indeed not something that I address in my dissertation. Maybe I can answer this question based on the available evidence or available literature. And I also do not think there are many research on that. But there is one study actually, specifically within the domains of mathematics, and I think the delay was about 30 days. And there students learn how to compute the volumes of different geometric shapes, and then they engage in a problem-solving task in this study. And if my recollections are correct, even 30 days after they saw a rather robust interleaved benefit. Of course, I would approach this finding a little bit more caution, and definitely more replication is needed. So my initial hunch would be maybe perhaps not greater difference, but some benefits of interleaving I would expect.
Okay, thank you very much. I give the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Professor Joosten ten Brinke. The next opponent is Professor Fred Paas. He is Professor of Educational Psychology at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Professor Paas.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. And dear candidate, I would also first like to congratulate you with the research you have done in your PhD project. It was a great pleasure to read your thesis, and I think it's truly commendable to see that you did already publish 3 of your 5 chapters in very good journals. And the other 2 will also be published soon, I'm sure. But I also have some questions, of course. And the first question actually came up during a meeting I had this week with your colleagues from TU Delft. On Monday, I had a board meeting there for the Teaching Academy Initiative on Innovation, Delft Engineering Education, where your colleagues presented the progress of their projects. And in one of the projects, which focuses on achieving long-term retention of knowledge and skills, and I think in engineering education and also mathematics, the question arose of how to ensure that students choose desirable difficulties. That is, they choose learning strategies that require more effort and may give them the impression that they are performing worse over strategies that are less effortful and give them the impression that they perform better. Specifically, they were thinking about implementing interleaved practice. So could you elaborate on this challenge, how this could be addressed, and what practical recommendations you could offer to help your colleagues at the technical university to encourage them for students to adopt these effortful but ultimately more effective training methods? Of course, I know that you found that refutations and visual prompts were effective methods, but so I'm especially interested to hear your ideas about other methods, and then specifically focused on STEM education, whether you think that the interleaved practice is also effective within STEM education, and how you could help your colleagues with that.
Highly esteemed opponent. I think there are some great examples, one coming from my colleagues and from my team. In Maastricht University, we have a study smart training, which actually started even before I joined the team. Study smart training, and there are actually some other examples in the literature, for instance, knowledge, beliefs, commitment, and planning framework by our colleagues from the United States. These are, I think, great starting points, because there is this available literature already showing us how to promote the use of self-regulated use of desirable difficulties. My first recommendation to my colleagues from Delft would be or I would actually try to put them in touch with our team here so that we can actually learn from each other. But at a more practical level, I think these study smart training or the knowledge, beliefs, commitment, and planning framework, there are some common steps that we follow. I think both frameworks, we agree that a strong knowledge basis is really important. So we need to help students to be aware of such desirably difficult strategies. Also, we need to create these practice opportunities where they can engage in desirable difficulties with their own learning materials. And I think there we need to increase the communication with educational designers and with our domain-specific experts so that we can see actually how we can create such conditions where we can create, students can apply desirable difficulties. I think in first place, it may sound like a difficult challenge, but I think once we have this interdisciplinary communication, I think things become much more clear. Also, in my own example, I knew very little about auscultation training. I wouldn't actually think, because I do not have any medical education background, that would be very difficult for me to assume that actually that could be a strategy, could be used in auscultation training. But through that communication with domain experts, then we start seeing these possibilities where desirable difficulties can play a role. And in STEM education specifically, I do think desirable difficulties can come really handy. Distributed practice, in my opinion, can be applied in any academic domain, spacing out our study sessions. In STEM education, there are like many foundational courses. I do think retrieval practice would also play a role. So I do think STEM education also in general would be like a nice spot to examine the effectiveness of our desirable difficulties. In case of interleaved practice, I think there are 1 or 2 studies, for example, that examine the efficacy in calculus training and also in physics education with electric circuits. So I think by consulting to such literature, I think we can come out more examples where we see the value of using desirable difficulties.
Okay, thank you. Well, interestingly, in your answer, you mentioned space practice as a desirable difficulty, and the definition you give of desirable difficulties is that they actually increase effort, yes. Like that they impose a higher effort or a higher load on the learners. But with space practice, it's just the other way around. It actually is less effortful than block practice, I think.
In general, the way that I approach desirable difficulty is more of a bit of like an umbrella term. So I would be less concerned whether, for example, the amount of difficulty it is involved. I would try to focus on the cognitive mechanisms that would help students learning. With spaced practice, in terms of the effort experience, I can imagine perhaps the effort experience could be salient at different phases of study. So for example, in space practice, the second repetition, then students need to engage in retrieval. They need to remember what they have studied before. We know that retrieval practice is actually more effortful than rereading. So I can assume maybe that in that very specific moment, the effort demands of space practice can be experienced by students. Over time, I'm thinking whether that effort experience, I would probably hypothesize a similar trend like interleaved practice. I would expect over time to space practice to also get a bit more easier for students. I don't know if this would answer your question.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I have one other question. So I think that it is a natural tendency of human beings to choose the less effortful way to achieve your goal. So I can imagine that well, in your studies you found that students choose, well, after you presented them with refutations and visual prompts, they choose more often for for interleaved practice in your experiment, and also after 1 week. But do you think that they would also still do that after 1 month and maybe for other topics? Because I would think, well, if it's a natural tendency, they will always revert back to that and choose. Yeah.
I think, just a moment, please. I think like when I approach self-regulated learning, by definition, it is a very goal-oriented process. And I can imagine that students' learning goals that would also interact with the way that they are behaving. So for example, in a learning environment where summative assessment is a big thing, I can imagine that such improvements that I observed in my experiments may not survive because again, that would be, if the goal of a student is to pass an exam, not really long-term learning, I can imagine they divert back to the block practice. So I do think motivational factors as well as the environment which we are embedded in would interact with the way that we behave. So I would be hesitant to assume that like even 1 week, 1 month later or 2 months later, they will still engage in interleaved practice. Therefore, I think one of my recommendations would be these like type of my interventions, they are the starting point. They are not really the end and a quick fix to a bigger problem. But I think that would be a solid starting point.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Paas. The position will be continued by Professor Julian Rölle. He is professor at the Ruhr University in Bochum at the Faculty of Philosophy and Educational Research, and that's in Germany. Professor Rölle.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, I also would like to compliment you on your dissertation and presentation. It was a pleasure to read your studies, and as you know, I also am involved in interleaving research right now, so I hope that we can connect during the next 9 minutes. My first question would be, in your dissertation, you make the case that interleaving is a desirable difficulty. And in your presentation, you said it's mentally more taxing, and in your studies, you find some kind of evidence, of course, in support of this notion. Learners appear to perceive learning with interleaved sequences as more demanding. I sometimes have difficulties understanding why that is or why that should be the case. Why would learning with interleaved sequences be more demanding? Is it that detecting differences is more difficult than detecting commonalities? Is it the inherent temporal spacing you were already talking about some minutes ago? Is it something else? Do learners simply don't know how to approach learning with interleaved sequences? What is your theoretical explanation? And do you think that the origin of the difficulty would matter for the design of the interventions that you're engaged in?
Highly esteemed opponent. Thank you for your kind words. Where the effort demands of interleaved practice comes from. Perhaps first I can approach this question from cognitive load perspective. When we practice through blocking, we activate a rule in our working memory, and then that rule would be still present when we are studying the following like subsequent exemplars. And I can imagine, because this rule is still very active in our working memory, there is no additional demand to reactivate it. But in interleaved practice, each time from one category to another, we need to reactivate we need to activate a new rule. So then I think also being able to engage in this, like looking for differences and like reactivation of the rule, I think that could be one reason why interleaved practice becomes a bit more effortful than block practice. Second reason, it was not my hypothesis, but a good colleague of mine, he once pointed out, perhaps that is the reason is because the goals of students, because in my studies as well as in the literature, we found that students know that blocking would help them to find similarities. But they also think the type of a task they engage in would require them to process such similarities. But what we know is that actually they should focus on the differences they need to more distinguish. So perhaps this mismatch between the goals they are looking for commonalities, and they try to do that with interleaving. Perhaps also that could be the reason due to this mismatch between goal structure and the affordance of strategies leading to additional effort. So these are two mechanisms from the top of my head, I believe, that would contribute to the effort demands of interleaving. One additional comment I can make is the way that I see such ratings, metacognitive ratings, subjective ratings. If we follow that conceptualization, we would also need to acknowledge that they are based on the available cues. So for example, in this case, perhaps the goal could be one cue. One's beliefs in their abilities to perform a certain task could be another cue, for instance, in the case of mathematics or in STEM field. So I can also imagine some other motivational factors, perhaps one's self-efficacy within a domain could also interact with the effort experience.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I would have another question. In your dissertation, you make the case that learners lack metacognitive knowledge, and that this is part of the reason why learners do not engage in learning with interleaved sequences. I wondered, when reading your dissertation, even if learners had this knowledge, they would still need to know whether the categories they are learning are easily confusable. Wouldn't they? Because in the meta-analysis by Richter and Brunmeier, I think you're well aware of it, they show interleaving only works well if the categories are confusable, and if they are not, then blocking would be the best option. Isn't that kind of a problem in your interventions, that learners would be motivated to engage in interleaving, but never really know whether it would be worth the while?
In my opinion, we need to help students to increase their arsenal of learning strategies. What I observed in my studies is they indeed lack this metacognitive knowledge on interleaved practice, and perhaps in some cases the categories are going to be dissimilar. But when categories become similar, they will still need this knowledge. So I think in general, my first answer would be it is still important for students to be aware of available strategies they can apply. Desirable or undesirable. And I think in the end, desirability of a strategy, that really depends on that interaction between task demands, cognitive mechanisms the strategy can afford, and students' characteristics such as prior knowledge. Specifically for, in the case of interleaved practice, I think we can approach this from the mechanisms through which students would benefit from interleaving. For example, if the categories are highly similar, I can imagine the discriminative contrast, being able to engage in distinguishing, that would be really helpful. If categories are really dissimilar, but I do think there is still one mechanism that can help students to benefit from interleaved practice, and that would be the distributed practice hypothesis. Because interleaving, in a way, it would inherit spacing. So if spacing is like beneficiary for learning, I would also expect interleaved practice, even in the case of dissimilar categories, help students to at least help students to benefit from the strategy. Do I have time, or sorry? Sorry, I have some other opinions, but please, if you have another if you have another questions, please carry on.
Yeah, it would be a brief follow-up question. Do you have any idea how to train students or foster students' understanding on when the categories are sufficiently confusable? Do you have a rule of thumb for them?
That would be quite a difficult task, because even for an expert to decide which categories are similar or dissimilar, I think to a certain extent that will depend on one's prior knowledge and expertise level. But perhaps what I can recommend to students would be which stage you are in your learning. Are you in the acquisition phase, newly encountered information, or are you in the practice phase? You already obtained the information and now you need to practice. I think in the case of, and I think these are the like the circumstances we can teach or communicate to students. In the phase of practice, my expectation would be that students can always engage in interleaved practice, because also that is how the assessment is designed in a way. In the case of accusation, my studies, available literature, many of them are like specifically focused on accusation phase, and still we see the benefit of interleaving. So if not entirely, I would recommend students to perform certain amount of interleaving. That would also be consistent with the available literature, comparing hybrid schedules to pure interleaving or pure blocking. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I give the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Professor Rulle. The position will be continued by Professor Leo Köhler. She is Professor of Clinical Anatomy at Maastricht University. Professor Köhler.
Dear candidate, first of all, I want to congratulate you with your thesis that I read with great pleasure, and it also crushed a few of my beliefs, things that I told my students about their learning strategies. So I certainly have a few questions for you. First of all, the desirable difficulties, I tell my students no pain, no gain. That's just like in the sports center. But then I've also learned that there is cognitive overload. How does a self-regulated learner distinguish between the two? When does the student say, okay, this is still desirable and this is killing me?
Highly esteemed opponent. Again, that would be a very challenging task for a student. I think in general, one difficulty to self-regulated learning is being able to know when to seek discomfort, when to seek effort, and also to be able to balance that with our available resources. And I think maybe I can self-reflect a bit. I would question whether our expectations from students, to what extent that would be fair. Whether we can really assume students to be able to make such decisions or like be engaged in such considerations. Therefore, my recommendation would be, or what I would try to do, is to actually balance that, perhaps through a bit more guided support in the beginning, and then fading away that support slightly less. I think in the very beginning, that would be quite challenging for students to be able to know when the effort they engage is in the at a sufficient level. I would try to see that a problem of we can tackle together, educators, instructors, together with our students. And as they develop such self-regulatory skills, I think through experience, maybe they can get better at balancing this load.
Okay, so you are actually increasing my workload, not that of the student. Okay. Then there is another thing. You said you had these systems where you flag students whether they are in need of more support or less support. And I've just been reading a novel, The Every, where we are all constantly monitored by Facebook and Amazon and WhatsApp and whatever. And I got a bit scared. And now you're telling me you're monitoring even more. What is the issue with privacy here? Because now I actually am looking for a student how he or she is learning, and it really invades a personal space in my opinion. How do you treat that? Is that not a question of privacy?
I think our ethical boards are doing a great job.
Okay.
When we are conducting our research. They make us really self-reflect on the type of data we are working with.
Well, that's actually a very good answer.
But I think in self-regulated learning research, indeed, there is this increased use of multimodal data, and sometimes, indeed, I think it is a privacy concern. For example, in more specifically emotion regulation research. In my case, we trace their choices. I would say rather harmless, but now also we observe their emotional state, emotional well-being, motivation, and I think they also, being fair to them, they engage actively with these ethical considerations. But as you said, my answer was.
Okay. And then I also have to give the study smart training. I learned that from Felicitas, sometimes with success, sometimes with less. But I also understand now from your thesis that I had some misconceptions. I thought if my students have a case which involves anatomy and physiology, I just tell them mix the two, don't study only the anatomy, but study the physiology in between. But I understand now that is more spaced learning rather than interleaved. But how can a student organize the learning material in a way that if they have a case where anatomy and physiology interact and strengthen the concepts that students have, how can they make this an interleaved practice?
I think this is one of the biggest challenges to interleaved practice, because to be able to engage in such alternation, we need the materials from, I don't know, topics way ahead. Mm-hmm. But the way that we design our education actually wouldn't allow students to do that. So one consideration would be, knowing that actually students can benefit from interleaving, do we also want to design our education in a way that would already incorporate these integrations between different topics more together, actually, mm-hmm. in a more integrated manner rather than separated sequential fashion. Some studies in the literature, actually, they are already trying to do that. So, for example, when they try to teach, I think, physics concepts, because what we know now is going to be helpful for what we are going to do next. So perhaps one approach would be this whole task approach, where all these units or categories, they serve for a unified purpose. I think in that way, that would become a bit more clear for students to know to know how to organize learning materials in an interleaved fashion. As it is, I think the challenge would be interleaving would be something they can really perform during the practice phase, because once they go in the current design that we have in a sequential manner, after everything, there is still going to be the practice period needed. So then students can engage in interleaved practice. The other possibility would be that already, for example, be engaging in interleaved practice within units in closer proximity. So for example, after the first unit, when you learn the second unit, you can already try to see whether you can make some alternations.
So does that mean the practice phase is something that I as a teacher have to organize in more detail, or is that something that I can?
I think the practice phase students would be, given that they receive the sufficient training, I think at the practice phase I would assume that students would be ready to apply interleaved practice in a self-regulated, independent manner.
Can I have one very short question? How do you study your educational theories? Do you study them in an interleaved way? Or?
I think we do in educational psychology, mm-hmm. in developmental psychology, there are these different phases of mm-hmm. developmental stages, and then there are some different psychologists. Mm-hmm. We block them.
Okay, thank you very much. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you, Professor Köhler. The fifth and last opponent is Professor Judith Siebe. She is Associate Professor at Maastricht University. Professor Siebe.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, of course, I also want to join in the congratulations. And you studied a complex yet relevant topic, very recognizable, and I admire especially the thorough and systematic and detailed approach to your research, the way each next study builds on the previous one. So well done. And yeah, we have never met before, but after reading just a few pages, I already recognize so much of what you are describing. So it's really real life material. Of course, I have a question for you too, and that's also a bit more implementation related. And maybe it's that end of year mindset to ponder about time, but that's what I want to discuss with you about. Besides working in research, I'm a teacher in the medical curriculum, and which has currently a large emphasis on self-regulated learning. And recently I was coaching several students who had to remediate because they were not on track regarding their development of basic biomedical knowledge, as we measure with the progress test. And during the meetings with these students, we not only worked on content and practiced, interleaved, by the way, but we also discussed their use of adequate learning strategies. And I think can refer here to the group of students that in your presentation labeled as yellow. These students, they do acknowledge that the use of ineffective strategies was part of their problem of lagging behind. And they were aware of, and they also recognized the importance of strategies like interleaved practice. They all participated in the already mentioned study smart trainings. But yet they stated that they had lacked time to invest to change their learning methods in general, whether it's interleaved practice or other desirable, difficult strategies, especially during their self-study phases. So in other words, the daily course of affairs, they have a busy schedule, heavy loaded curriculum with assignment deadlines, etc. Students can simply not always afford to slow down, step back, invest their time in delving into these desirable, difficult strategies, even if they wanted to. It means editing and reorganizing your materials at first to be able to start with that. So given these real-life limitations, what recommendations could you give to students and maybe to me as coach to deal with this? How can we make it happen despite it already high student workload and high-paced curricula?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words. First, I would say I personally sympathize with your students because at the age of 18, 19, students pursue multiple goals. It is not just about our education, it's not just about passing our exams. But also many students, they need to work on the side. I spent some time in the United States during my PhD process, and there actually I observed a little bit more dramatic situation. Many students even have to work 2 times in 2 additional jobs. So again, I think my approach would be to manage my expectation from students a bit. Whether my request from students that can be that will be affordable by students with the available resources they have. And one possibility is to actually create such time in our educational curriculum and design. Maastricht University, in that case, I would think is it more like a leading and then more aware of this situation. But even for study smart training, for example, we have only studied like 3 weeks to be able to implement this workshop. I wonder how would that be? For example, if we acknowledge the need and the time that takes to develop such self-regulatory skills in terms of how to manage our learning, and whether we could give students more practice, like more time in the beginning of their academic curriculum. But that would be more like a structural solution I could offer. The other thing I can recommend to students is maybe to point out to point their attention to, for example, in my studies and many available literature in desirable difficulties, we actually control for time. So the amount of time students spend on learning tasks, that would be very similar. Actually, that would be identical with blocking and interleaving, even though interleaving is a bit more effortful. But actually, they are going to learn much more. In that sense, actually, like investing in that behavioral change, that would save them time in the long term.
In the end, yeah. But to find the time to start it, that's often the, yeah.
Yeah. I think, again, maybe one solution would be to a bit more systematic approach, creating these practice opportunities, giving students sufficient time to be able to develop self-regulatory skills already within their ongoing curriculum. So not really, wouldn't be something that we try to solve a problem once it appears, but try to tackle that in a more proactive manner, preventive manner, in the beginning of their academic curriculum, where they have less time pressure on themselves, because I can imagine if they are realizing this issue very close to an exam period, then the time pressure is much higher. But if we can help them engage in such processes in the beginning of the academic year, perhaps they would also have this sufficient time.
Yeah, I would gladly agree with that and build it that way, but it would mean taking time away from other learning outcomes. So that would be a difficulty. Yeah, but it comes down to your ecological validity and how to go beyond the experiments within a single activity or a single course, and how to embed it and make it possible, make it happen in a entire curriculum. How could we? Do you have any idea how we can take that into account in future research? Do you have any suggestions?
How to implement the strategy training, perhaps in an ongoing course.
How we can see, how we can research, study how to implement this at a curriculum level.
First of all, I wouldn't like to do that research. I can imagine all the challenges involved, all the stakeholders involved, and then being able to get everybody on board. Also about the measurement, how to measure that type of research. But I think there are good examples. Maastricht University is, I think, one of the first problem-based learning university, and then that curriculum change happened at a university level, like at a very high scale level. So I assume in the literature there are these like good steps, because also this change in our the whole educational design that is informed by research. So it is not a type of research I'm very familiar with, but my first step would be to see actually how these initial steps were taken in such studies where they engage in such dramatic changes. Yeah, I don't know if that would answer your question.
It's a nasty question. I think it's difficult, but I think that's the transition we need between the very well designed smaller experiments, and I think that's what we see in more SRL research. It's often very confined, but we have to implement it in a larger context.
Mr. Onan, as you see in here, the time for defending your thesis has passed. The committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis, and in particular the quality of your defense. And I ask you to remain here until we return.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. The line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Traveling so far from home, gathering now. better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Mr. Onan, the committee here present has considered the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of this positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. And Professor De Bruin is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom and law. I invite now your supervisors to take the floor. Professor De Bruin.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Erdem Onan, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate, signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Dear Erdem, it is my honor to be the second to congratulate you, your achievement in obtaining your PhD. This congratulations also extend to your family members and also to Panar, your partner. And this achievement by no means is no small feat. Throughout this day, or perhaps this week, you might have been reflecting on your journey, the preparation and the execution of your PhD training. You know, the typical preparation, execution, reflection phase of self-regulation that you embody so much. Allow me, on behalf of my fellow supervisors, Anik and Felicitas, to share our reflection of this journey too. To start, I would like to apologize for my contribution to your challenges at the beginning of your PhD journey, as I could not continue to stay in Maastricht as I initially had planned. COVID-19 followed shortly after you start in November 2019, which added to numerous delays and challenges in data collection, participants recruitment, and so on. But you have come prepared. It is not surprising that Anik and Dirk Branson, who interviewed you for this position, had such good impression on you over the other candidates. You quickly figure out how to set up our first experiments in Qualtrics, which is presenting paintings in Interleaved and block orders. On top of that, we figure out how to integrate real-time plots using JavaScript, plots that you all been seeing during the defense, which allowed us to create an intervention, the visual feedback practice, the way we had envisioned. Well, close to what we had envisioned. I also remember many trials and errors we have done over multiple versions of our first experiment. I also remember not long after you have completed our design, you have already started corresponding with Eva Janssen and her master students at Utrecht University. This allows you to establish a collaborative work at the onset of your PhD, an accomplishment not many students had achieved at this stage. You realize that perhaps not many students learned how to recognize painters in real life. Thus, building from the success of a first experiment, you wanted to quickly move on to more ecologically valid stimuli, X-rays and brain scans that may be studied by medical students. However, COVID-19 did not allow us to yet run this experiment. But you did not falter. We figured out an intervention, exciting follow-up with paintings. At the same time, you also started learning R from a very terrible teacher, who, the way my friends and I called it, are used to ghetto coding. You quickly learn how to implement complex statistical analysis, I have a fond memory of you explaining slopes and intercepts in mixed models, both online and in Oostende during my visit in 2022. We went back and forth quite some time on this. I still found an email in 2023 where we discussed slopes and intercepts in regression and ANOVA with color coding and everything. Not only that you have built your technical skills as, dare I say, an experimental psychologist, during your PhD, Felicitas, Anik, and I also think that your knowledge on the literature is very exceptional. It did not take you long to get familiar with the literature at the start, and we are thoroughly impressed by how you can quickly recognize different articles, authors, and journals. You have strong social skills. At the faculty, you are always really social with the lab and the department. You have efficiently helped organizing many lunches, coffee breaks, and meetings at conferences. In recess meetings, Anik told me that you oftentimes, the only thing that she had to do is to bring you next to the people she'd like to introduce you to, and then you would immediately take over from there. At Psychonomics, this role even reverses. You introduce Anik and Felicitas to Kirkpatrick, whom you had just met the day before. You also have developed strong friendship during your PhD. Naturally with the lab members, but especially also with Roman Abel from Bochum University, with whom we have collaborated closely over the last 2 papers. Some birds even told me that you guys are known as the Interleaving brothers around this part. I also remember fondly of your enthusiasm on the possibility to collaborate with Veronica Jan's lab in Austin, Texas. And I was really happy when you finally got the opportunity to visit her lab in person for 2 weeks. Of course, your journey is not entirely devoid of problems. During the early days of COVID, you struggled quite some with the isolation, especially since you weren't really happy with the housing situation back then. Some problems are even more personal. You got bit by a tick on your birthday during the EFG conference in Staufen in 2022. You tried to keep your calm and politeness as much as possible, even though the frustration was quite apparent on your face. Luckily, Felicitas' dad came to the rescue when you had to stop in Trier. As for the housing and the overall post-COVID situation, it also improved, as you managed to find a better housing situation and resume your participation in sports, especially basketball that you love so much. You also even combined this hobby with work, as you managed to recruit quite a number of participants from those who played basketball with you. I also remember your frustration with our feedback, something that we all can relate so much from our research days. Sometimes we ask for more details, and when you provided more details, we asked you to be more concise. And then we asked you to expand your arguments again. Or worse, we forgot that we have asked some version ago and why we had asked for it. A never-ending dance. At other times, we asked you to do something that you think or were sure of not going to work. But a breakthrough finally occurred in 2023 when you told me in one of our meetings that one of us had asked you to do something that you did not agree on, but you would do it anyway, since you wanted to understand and accommodate our perspectives. I remember sending Anik and Felicitas an email after this conversation. Look, Erdem has learned to compromise. He has grown so much. I think this is one of the happiest moments during my supervision. Overall, you are a very industrious, goal-driven person. These 2 adjectives are not typically associated with niceness, but somehow you're a nice guy too. So please keep it this way. We think you have collected all the necessary ingredients to become successful in academia. The ability to reason, and the ability to be kind when reason fails. How you play these ingredients together to achieve sufficiency remains in your hands. But the 3 of us are confident that you'll figure it out. Erdem, congratulations once again, and I hope you can enjoy today and the next couple of days before you start working again at Delft.
Esteemed Dr. Onan, dear Erdem, it's my great pleasure to congratulate you with your doctorate, and I congratulate you also on behalf of Maastricht University. And I would like to share some impressions of the committee with you. We have seen a very clear summary of your thesis, and we have also critically read your well-written thesis of good quality, which is based on a combination of studies, which are well-designed, systematic, and well-performed. And we have seen that a number of studies, and probably the rest will follow, a number of studies have been published already in scientific literature. With respect to your defense, we have seen responses which were very interesting and adequate, and we enjoyed the discussion that we had. You have shown that you are very knowledgeable of not only the impact but also of the limitations of your studies. And you are also well aware of the literature that has been performed, and in that context it was already placed good within the context of the already known literature and data. And we have seen that you have demonstrated that you are an independent scientist and able to perform scientific studies. So I would not only like to congratulate you with that result, but also your three supervisors, Professor Annick de Bruin, and then I have to look at my papers for the names of the other supervisors, Dr. Felicitas Biewer and Dr. Vishnu Virajani. Congratulations with the result in terms of the publications, in terms of the thesis, and also of this defense today. I would like to include in my congratulations also your partner and also your parents. I think they are sitting on the first row here. Congratulations with the result. And also I would like to include other members of the family that are probably not present today here. Congratulations also to your colleagues, your friends, and other acquaintances. Congratulations with the young doctor that we see today here. I would like to thank all the members of both committees, both the assessment committee and the degree committee. Thank you for critically reading the manuscript, and I would like specifically to thank the external members of the committee, Professor Paas here present and Professor Rulle present online. Thank you for your efforts and your critically reading. Maastricht University appreciates your contributions. Before I close the ceremony, I would like to invite Professor Rulle to congratulate you. He is now present on the screen. There he is. The floor is yours, Professor Rulle.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Adam, I will make it very quick. Congratulations. Your doctorate was very well deserved. You did a great job today, and I look forward to reading your future publications, collaborating on future studies with you, and seeing how you will all turn us into interleavers in the next years. Enjoy the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rulle. Before I close the ceremony, I would like to ask you to stay here in the aula. We will first make a picture here with Professor Rulle still on the screen. I think that our supporter will bring him back to the screen here. So we will take a picture here, and after closing the ceremony, we will take another picture in the hall. And then after that, I would like to, when we have left, you may go already to the rafter where there is a reception. And we can congratulate Dr. Onan. Hereby I close this academic ceremony.